You're going about your days with something under the surface. You're paying your bills, grocery shopping, occasionally remembering that you have hamstrings, going to stretch them, and then instantly regretting your life choices. Outside your windows, there's the twittering of birds and the smell of wildfire smoke, and all the while, there's something lurking beneath the surface, a question that a deeper part of you needs answered. Where do I start with Czech literature? For real though, life is wondrous and weird and almost always more difficult than you think it'll be, and Czech authors really get that. My name is Jennifer and this is my specialty, so I doubt I'll ever be more excited for another video than I am for this one. It really is like creating my own Christmas morning over here. There are only a few Czech authors who've really gotten into the bloodstream of English language literature, which means there are books out there that a lot of you would love that just haven't naturally crossed your paths yet. So that's what we're doing today. I'm starting you off with 15 different options, 15 different entry points, and I've designed this so that this list has something for almost everyone. Books that feel like a warm hug, books that are so bleak you might need to reread the ones that feel like a hug. I have some poetry on here, essays, classics, historical fiction, non-fiction, and of course novels and novellas from the 19th century to today. A lot of these are major books in one way or another, innovative, influential, widely taught in the Czech Republic, but I also chose each one of these titles individually because it's a great read. I am all about you having a good time with your reading. So let's do this. We begin the kit with 5 different classic options. Most of the countries of East Central Europe have literary founding fathers, but in the Czech case, we also have a founding mother. Her name is Božena Němcová, and her great 19th century novel is called The Grandmother. I read the translation by Francis Gregor, and Czech viewers might be amused to hear this, but this is genuinely one of my favorites from the list. Oh, it's lovely. We follow a character that everyone simply calls Grandmother as she moves from her beloved village to her daughter's new home in northeastern Bohemia to help care for her 4 children. Grandmother becomes a fixture in the community because of her wisdom and her bluntness and the way she can talk to anybody of any background. She's one of those types where it's like, to her, people are people. And this becomes a portrait of 1 to 2 years of village stories and traditions. We see the days rolling into the seasons, rolling into the years of a life in 1820s Bohemia. Němcová was preserving the specifics of her own childhood, and the book that the grandmother reminded me of most was Little Women. I think Little Women readers would really enjoy this. Although interestingly, it shares some of Alcott's sentimental qualities, but there's less sentimentality to the writing itself in here. To be honest, I didn't know what to expect from an 1892 translation in a print-on-demand edition, but I thought Gregor did a nice job of maintaining how beautifully plain-spoken a lot of this text is. It's a novel that's mostly in the realism tradition, but it also has some elements of romanticism. And that combination means that it ends up both idealizing this period and showing some of its harsher realities. Many Czech readers have a ton of affection for this. When I told people I was reading it, typically the first reaction was, "Aww." Others, especially younger people, maybe associate Babička with being forced to read it in school. But for me, this was one of the best reading experiences of my year. There are so many tales that are spun in here, and each one is memorable and moving. And I honestly think if it weren't for broader language politics, this would be discussed more often, not just as a significant Czech novel, but also as a significant European novel. We quickly arrive at the most famous title on this list. It's Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis, translated by Susan Bernofsky. Is there any author who makes humor more miserable or makes misery funnier? I'm not even a huge Kafka person, and I've always found The Metamorphosis irresistible. This is the story of Gregor, who wakes up in his bed on an otherwise normal day to find that his body has been transformed into the body of a giant insect-like creature. And the crucial detail here is that neither Gregor nor anybody else questions how or why this has happened. It's immediately treated as a calamity, but also as a fact of life. If you had snapped a picture of me in the process of reading this, my face would have been frozen in horrified laughter. Even from the get-go, just from the details of Gregor waking up on his back and then trying to figure out how to maneuver himself out of bed. I think Bernofsky's translation is my favorite of the ones I've read over the years because of the way it balances the tone, finding that grim humor in Gregor's formality. His honorable intentions that never yield good results for him now that he's been reconfigured as physically other. Some of you may fairly think I've gone out on a limb with this one because because it was written in German. So to keep things brief, I'll say that for me, Kafka is first and foremost a global writer writer. Secondly, he's a German language writer, of course. But thirdly, he's a writer of Prague, and there's been a movement among Czech scholars in the 21st century to reincorporate those writers of the Czech lands who didn't write in Czech back into an expanded and more nuanced national canon. And I'm drawn to the paradoxes of that project. Regardless, I see the Metamorphosis as both an artistic and a practical addition to people's everyday lives. It's only 120 pages, including the introduction and the afterword. I read half of this in the span of a hair appointment. I'd recommend it to literary fanatics, to people who are trying to fit in 1 or 2 more books per year, to college students, to book clubs, and of course to anybody planning to visit Prague. After our little German language detour, we come to the Czechest book that was ever Czech. It's The Good Soldier Švejk by Jaroslav Hašek, translated by Cecil, Parrott, and for better and for worse, this has become one of the main reference points for the Czech national character, and what a bizarre and wonderful book to be elevated to that status. Our hero is Josef Švejk, who was removed from military service after being certified as an imbecile, but the first sentence of the book sets the scene perfectly. It's, "And so they've killed our Ferdinand, and Švejk is determined to serve Austria-Hungary in this new great war." Now, there's plenty that's debated about this character. What most people can agree on is that Švejk is a simple man who's not stupid. There's an argument to be made that he's wily, that he's playing dumb this whole time with all these different authority figures. Others talk about Švejk being a representation of something called selský rozum, which translates to something like farmer's wit or a common person's common sense. And he does distill something about the humorous Czech way of dealing with the tragedy of greater world events. In any case, you have the figure of Švejk clamoring to go to war for Austria-Hungary, and everybody assumes that only an idiot would feel this way. But actually, it's his earnest approach that highlights the idiocy of this war and of this bloated bureaucratic empire. This is like if you combined an episodic, somewhat long-winded 19th century novel with Catch-22. Some of you will hear big, winding classic and be like, yes, please. For the rest of you, here's what I propose. If this does sound interesting to you, but you're not sure about making like the big commitment to it, I don't want you to have an all or nothing feeling about it. So for the official starter kit, I'm assigning you part 1, which takes you up to page 216. Read through part 1, and then if you're enjoying yourself, you can slow down and maybe read 20 pages a week for the next few months. Really embrace the episodic nature of this, hold it lightly, and have it be a fun supplementary part of your reading. Because Hašek was having fun, I can tell you that. Science fiction people, your moment has come, because next I want to recommend War with the Newts by the great Karel Čapek, translated in this edition by M&R Weatherall. And really the headline news here is that you don't have to be a science fiction reader to love this. I've read woefully little science fiction, and I had several amazing beach reading sessions with this. It starts with this random captain who discovers a new species of salamander or newt-like creatures off the Indonesian island of Sumatra. But it turns out these creatures aren't just curiosities, they can be taught to use tools, to complete complex tasks, and ultimately to speak human languages. This book was published in 1936, and it's eerie to consider that because it's a loose allegory for 20th century European politics and news media and short-sighted technological innovations. It's a story about the driving forces of exploitation and greed. And most of all, it's about humans' utter refusal to think ahead, to actually consider the potential consequences of their choices. Čapek is so biting and intelligent on this point, it was honestly cathartic to read. But he's never pedantic, it's all so entertaining, and there's a real lightness to the way he makes these heavy observations. Čapek was such an interesting thinker, with maybe one of the most varied bodies of work on this list. He was the hardest one to choose a starting point for, but I ultimately chose War with the Newts because it's currently more accessible than some of his other work. He was a pacifist, which influenced a lot of his writing. Fun fact, he was the person who invented the term robot. And my Czech tutor told me recently that she thinks if we do learn at some point that some people throughout history have had access to time machines, she believes Čapek was one of those. That given the way he often wrote the future before it happened, it's not inconceivable that he actually was a time traveler. The final real classic on this list is Karel Čapek's We Were a Handful, translated by Mark Corner, and just looking at this book makes me smile. It is such a funny book, and not in the pitch black, life is nonsensical and kind of terrible ha 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 way. I mean, truly funny writing about what it's like to be a kid getting into all kinds of scrapes with your neighborhood pals. You know the early scenes in It's a Wonderful Life with all the boys walking down the street together and ordering ice cream from the soda shop and saying, I wish I had $1 million. Hot dog! This has that kind of nostalgic feeling, the warmer time of this specific childhood, and very possibly of your childhood too, wherever and whenever that was. In this case, our protagonist is Petr or Peter Bajza, whose father owns the general store in town. Peter and his friends muck about and are too clueless and too clever for their own good. I love the way this shows both the loyalty and the fickleness of neighborhood friendships. There's a boy Peter really likes until he won't lend him his bike, and then Peter thinks, well, I never really liked that guy anyway, but then they quickly become friends again. There's a scene where Peter gets in trouble for a prank, and when he's caught, he won't fess up until he's forced to. And then after he's punished, he blubbers and practices the violin as obnoxiously as possible and feels hard done by, even though he's the one who misbehaved and then lied about it. This one was like a scene from my own childhood. But the story behind this novel is that Hašek was a Czech Jewish writer, and he wrote Bylo nás pět in the early 1940s when he was waiting to be transported to the Terezín concentration camp. He wanted to immerse himself in this brighter time of growing up before the First World War. Hašek was ultimately transported to Auschwitz and then to another concentration camp in Poland where he died in 1945. And it's interesting, the final third of this story is about Peter falling seriously ill with scarlet fever, and he has these colorful, fantastical dreams about traveling the world with his friends and a circus elephant. Periodically, though, he wakes up from these visions to see that everybody at his bedside is very worried about him. And in a way, the whimsical dreams come to represent the feel of this book, and the moments when Peter is awake are more like the reality Hašek was facing. We Were a Handful went on to become a popular TV show, and both the show and the book are written in this completely delightful, old-timey, early 20th century Czech. Yeah, this is one of the ones I'm most excited to share with you. I think any of these 5 could appeal to a lot of different people, but if you're a big classics reader, the first third of this starter kit is going to be your happy place. Now we move into my abridged essentials of post-war Czech literature, 5 books from the second half of the 20th century. Up first is the shortest book on the list, and also the only one that's actually set during World War II. It's called Closely Watched Trains by Bohumil Hrabal, and it's translated by Edith Pargeter. Hrabal's work is considered by many to be the pinnacle of Czech 20th century writing, and this novella is a perfect sample of all the things he does so well. Closely Watched Trains is one of my favorite book openings. At one point I handed this to my brother and I said, read the first 10 pages, like you just have to. And when he finished, he handed it back to me and he said, what the hell did I just read? We begin in 1945. Not a good year, folks. Our main character is a young man named Miloš, who starts by telling us about the strange lives and times of his great-grandfather, grandfather, and father, an illustrious lineage of truly good-for-nothing men. Miloš at least has gainful employment. He works for the state railways, which under the German occupation means that he helps keep the trains running as they make their way to supply the German forces. And meanwhile, he's coming of age and experiencing all the nightmarish uncertainty of early amorous encounters. Hrabal has so many different kinds of humor in his arsenal: straight man delivery, irony upon irony, black humor, and also these moments that made me laugh out loud. The flying sign that says finished in 5 minutes. If you know, you know. But Hrabal combines all these eccentricities with some incredibly dark and striking imagery about human cruelty. The precision of his imagery is masterful, and it's one of the main reasons this was made into a very famous and acclaimed movie. But if you're a cinephile and you've already seen the movie, it's worth it to read the book too. I mean, for the book itself, but also because it has a slightly different, slightly darker ending. I'm asking for your forgiveness up front for this next title because currently it's out of print. But I have it on good authority from multiple sources that this is a top consideration to be recommissioned and republished, and it's so perfect for a starter kit that I wanted to make sure it's on people's radars for when it becomes available again, hopefully soon. It's a novel called Summer in Prague by Zdena Salivarová, and it's translated by Marie Wynn. Our protagonist is named Jana. She's in her early 20s. She's a chorus girl who's irritated with her colleagues because while they're off doing traveling performances, she's stuck in the heat and emptiness of the city for the summer. She has a big family and they live on top of one another in this tiny apartment, and she's bored and frustrated and stuck. But the thing about this bored and frustrated girl is that she's living in 1950s Prague, less than a decade into Czech communism. She's not allowed to travel abroad because her family is considered suspicious. Her brothers have been sent off to work in the uranium mines for anti-communist activity, and her family's apartment is in a state of decay while the authorities congratulate themselves on their world-renowned housing policies. It's pretty unusual to see this type of fiction set in the 1950s. So many stories about the communist era take place from the 1960s onwards. So you have this oppressive backdrop to everything, but meanwhile, Jana is so chatty and snarky about her life. The book really does feel like she's just telling you how it is. It's like, oh, I have to deal with this and this and this, and I'm not loving it. She's a great narrator because she's both pragmatic and naive, and she can be super judgy. But a big reason for that is she's the most dependable person in her family, which means she herself doesn't have anybody to depend on. Basically, unlike the portrayals of perfect socialist humans in state-approved fiction, this is a book about messy people. Along with her husband, the novelist Josef Škvorecký, Salivarová emigrated in 1968 after the Soviet invasion, and she and her husband settled in Toronto and established a publishing house there called 68 Publishers. That was a major factor in getting Czech language books into the hands of English language readers. So there would be poetic justice in getting her novel back into the hands of more English language readers and manifesting it. The most famous writer on this list in the Anglophone world is Milan Kundera, but Czech readers don't tend to start with The Unbearable Lightness of Being. Their entry point is often his earlier novel, The Joke, so I'm starting you off like a Czech. Our focal point is a man named Ludvík, who was a university student back in the earliest days of Czechoslovak communism. At 21, after he wrote some wry jokes about communism on a postcard, he was kicked out of the party and out of the university, which led him to seek work in the mines in the eastern part of the country. From that moment of being declared a traitor to the state, his life has felt like it was diverted into a completely different track. But this book isn't merely saying, look at this unfair thing that happened in this unfair society. It's about the way people process the course of their lives and the terrifying scope of what hasn't been within their control. And Ludvík's imperfect processing leads to a type of self-centeredness and also a hollowness that impacts his relationship with two women at different points in his life. He has this bitterness that he knows is justified and also completely useless. And actually, Kundera wants you to think through things in a way Ludvík can't. Maybe to question what other choices were available to those people who voted him out of the party, for example. John Updike's blurb for this includes the word ambivalent, which I think is the perfect descriptor. I know a lot of people who say Kundera was a genius, which is a big claim, but I do think there's a real touch of genius to this book, more so than his others, I would say. He would go on to use these cheeky third-person narrators who were sometimes explicitly meant to be Kundera stand-ins, but the joke is told with first-person perspectives. And it's funny, without that additional layer, all the strengths of his prose stand out even more clearly. This is the novel of his that I'll keep returning to. It is crisp and confounding and a fantastic read. Next is our first nonfiction option. It's a collection of work from Václav Havel called Open Letters. It was translated by various people, including the volume's editor, Paul Wilson. This is such a great compilation. You get a lot in just under 400 pages. You get some of his interviews, his prison correspondence, and most importantly, his essays. Havel first came to be known as a playwright, but over the years he increasingly wrote these essays about life under communism, and he became famous for having the courage to speak his truth at a time when there were serious consequences for that. I mean, I already mentioned prison correspondence. If you don't already know, Havel then went on to become the first president of a post-communist Czechoslovakia. Imagine having a playwright as your president. God, we could never. To me, there's something magnetic about Havel as an essayist. I mean, there are points where I disagree with his take on something, or I think he's stretched a metaphor a little too far, but I always find myself not really caring because it's such a treat to follow his thought process. I mean, that's what makes a great essayist. It's the journey of the thought. If you're someone who feels compelled to read every book from page 1 to the end, I'm going to challenge you to approach this one differently. Consider this an assignment. I think you should start with one of the shorter essays and my absolute favorite. It's called On Evasive Thinking. I'll leave the first 2 pages on screen so you can get a taste of it. It's so good. Then I think you should go to another short essay called 6 Asides About Culture, and then go on to the big one, the one that made serious waves when it was published in 1978, The Power of the Powerless. The last main thing to note here is that Havel's family was both well-established and wealthy before the communist takeover, which is a major reason he was never a communist. Havel is an ambiguous figure on this spectrum, but a lot of Czech writers are more on the Kundera end, where they really believed in communism at one point. And that later sense of disillusionment led them to question if there was any truth in anything. How do you trust yourself and your own beliefs again, let alone those of others? And all that is worthwhile to read, but you get something different with Havel because he's a man who's openly comfortable discussing morality. He's someone who has an openly moral and ethical outlook on the world, which leaves him open to criticisms of being simplistic or naive, for example. But I personally appreciate the conviction that he retained. The last post-war author is also a transition into the present because she died earlier this year in 2024. And it's a little strange because because for a few years now, whenever I've been asked, I've always named her as my favorite contemporary Czech author. It's Daniela Hodrová, and I think you should start with her debut novella, A Kingdom of Souls, which was translated by Vernik Firkusny and Elena Sokol. In the first scene, a woman named Alice Davidovich enters the kitchen to see that her grandfather is peeling an onion that was given to him by Alice's sweetheart, Pavel, who's coming to visit today. And Alice is going along with this, even though she doesn't know how any of it is possible, because Pavel departed on a transport long ago, and also her grandfather is dead. The book is focused on an apartment complex where the former and current occupants of the building are mixed together in the storytelling. We are Sixth Sense in it over here. But initially it's hard to tell the difference because in this world, dead people can grow older, they can give birth, they sometimes lose their minds after death, and some of them can interact with the living. Hodrová wrote this from 1977 to 78 in the stagnant and pretty depressing decade after the 1968 Soviet invasion. So it's no coincidence that she wrote as though history was both suppressed and ever present in Prague. It's a book that captures this feeling that both the living and the dead can't move on from the horrors of the 20th century because they weren't equipped or even permitted to process them. In A Kingdom of Souls, almost every character who lived in this apartment before the Second World War was then either murdered or collaborated with murderers, which is why the nearby Olszany Cemetery, which is the largest in Prague, becomes almost like another character in the book. The feel of this reminded me of Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, and thematically it's somewhat aligned with Lincoln and the Bardo by George Saunders. It's that genre of perfectly crafted chaos. I cannot believe this was a debut. It's not demanding on the line level, but the whole experience is so intricate with these echoes of Greek and Roman mythology, biblical stories, fairy tales. It's a literary feast. But you don't have to pick up on specific allusions to notice which symbols keep reappearing in the story and how they're functioning. I want to note for the record that when I approach something experimental, I am really patient with myself. I never expect myself to immediately get it, because a book like this is training your brain how to read it as you go, and that's one of the fun things about it. So it's going to take you, 30, 40, 50 pages to really get into the zone. Jantar has published Hodrová with a lot of care. I don't know anything specifically about this, but there's something about holding this beautifully constructed book with its sturdy paper and these end papers. I mean, it literally feels like the Jantar team loves Hodrová like I do, and I hope that some of you out there might come to love her too. Let's move on to our final section, the 5 books from the 21st century. The first of those was published in 2002. It's this novel called Of Kids and Parents by Emil Hakel, translated by Marek Tomin, and this is basically a father-son pub crawl. We have a son in his 40s and a father in his 70s, and they're basically just telling stories, arguing, ordering drink after drink, taking bathroom breaks, and then stumbling through different parts of the city to get to their next bar. What I love about this book is that the majority of it is dialogue. It's all of the random and personal and petty and weighty things that they say to each other in the course of the night. Hakel has a tendency to underdramatize, and because he's mimicking the rhythms of real conversation, we don't spend too much time on any one subject, but you do end up learning a lot about these men throughout the night. I think plenty of people would relate to the way that the son keeps getting annoyed with the father and then retreats into himself and is like, why am I even letting myself get annoyed? Like, I know how he is, it's not worth it. And then when he re-enters the conversation, he still can't course correct. But even though it's clear that this father and son have their issues, this is their way of bonding, and it is both meaningful and limited in the way that a lot of masculine-coded bonding can be. I wanted to be sure to include this one because bar culture is part of the social fabric of the Czech Republic, and I know it's that way in a lot of places, but trust me, Czechs consume way more beer per capita than any country. And I also wanted to include it because in this story we get a portrait of an imperfect, fairly ordinary parent-child relationship that's set against the backdrop of a Prague that's also treated as imperfect and completely ordinary. Now, some of you have the same sickness I have, where more often than not, you choose to read things that make you feel bad. If you've been patiently waiting through all these books where I said, oh, I smiled while I was reading this, your moment has come. And boy, do I have a little bundle of misery for you. It's a novel called The Lake by Bianca Belová, and it was translated by Alex Zucker and won the European Union Prize for Literature in 2016. And actually an even better word for it than miserable is desolate. We're following a boy named Nami who has grown up in a fishing village somewhere in the former Soviet Union, and the nearby lake has been steadily drying up. Nami has come of age in a period of ruin. There's the obliquely referenced collapse of the Soviet Union, and then he's also living in the shadow of environmental collapse that's reminiscent of the real-life Aral Sea, a formerly enormous lake between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan that between the 1960s and the early 2000s shrank by 90%. Devastating is an understatement for the impacts of this. In this village, there are almost no boundaries between childhood and adulthood and between adulthood and old age. It's like everybody is worn out before their time, and children like Nami experience violence and neglect and early hypersexualization. When his grandmother dies, he sets out to learn anything he can about his parents, and he ends up traveling through urban and rural landscapes and observing all these different adult lives. But with all this observation, he still has no idea of where or how he wants to live his own life, because how can you plan for a future when you've always lived in what felt like the rubble of the past? This isn't one for you if you're primarily a character-driven reader, but there's something that's mesmerizing about its settings and symbolism and its pared back style. The lake has such gritty realism to it that it ends up feeling surreal. And let's all take a moment to appreciate this author photo. I mean, come on. When you talk to people who are heavily involved in today's Czech literary scene, a lot of them will say that novels aren't where the best work is being produced, it's poetry. So I'm recommending a collection called Dream of a Journey by Kateřina Rudčenková, and this is translated by Alexander Buchler. And these are lonely, sensual poems filled with these images of winter skies and cherry smoke, the dark reflection of broken glass, cigars after sex. What she does is she captures the feeling of certain affairs or relationships where there's real seduction and passion, but the majority of life isn't lived within the stages of seduction and passion, it's lived before or after. And within these befores and afters, there's an edge of dissatisfaction and a sense of separateness. There are a number of poems where she describes being out of sync with a lover, walking ahead of or behind him, passing without meeting, striking out alone into the fields or the sand dunes. I typically try to read poetry in 2 stages. In stage 1, I read quickly through the whole collection, and I don't really let myself stop because I want to let the language wash over me. It can be hard for me to release my grip on it, you know? And then I go back in a second time and I read more carefully and I let myself stop wherever it feels natural. The thing about this collection is that I actually enjoyed that first reading experience so much that I went back in and read it a 3rd time, again quickly, with that like glancing touch. There are several working Czech poets who are more prolific and I think more prominent than Rudčenková, but their collections are harder to access in English. But I might have chosen this one anyway. It feels like drinking rich red wine and falling into a tumbled bed and dreaming uneasy dreams. If we want to talk about prominence though, this next author is the one who's been a true literary bestseller over the last decade. Her name is Kateřina Tučková, and I would recommend starting with her novel called The Last Goddess, translated by Andrew Oakland. If you read a lot of historical fiction, this is probably going to be your book from the list because I would describe it as an archival thriller. It's about a woman named Dora who grew up in the White Carpathian Mountains, which are in the easternmost part of the country along the Czech-Slovak border. These mountains historically have been a tough place to eke out a living, and they've also been so remote that they've kept a certain tradition alive going back centuries. It's a tradition called goddessing. Goddessing was essentially Christianity-based folk healing, and you had to be both born a goddess through your family line and then trained as one. Dora is now an academic who's done ethnographic research on these healing traditions, and in the late 90s, when the state starts opening the secret police archives from the days of communism, Dora learns that her aunt, one of the last goddesses of Žitková, was under police surveillance and that there's a file on her. I didn't love Tučková's book that was previously published in English. It's called Goethe, and I thought it veered between drama and melodrama, so I was honestly surprised by how much this book swept me up. It was genuinely suspenseful until the final chapter. I like the somewhat ambiguous way that the goddesses are portrayed. You do get the fullness of their perspective, and you see the unconscionable way that the communist secret agents targeted these women and effectively erased their way of life. But there are these moments in the archives when you see mentions of quackery, and it's like, yeah, there's a lot of that in healing circles, and Dora herself expresses some skepticism about all of this. I do think the first few pages of this are melodramatic, and that there are writing moments here and there that clang just a little bit, but I think Tučková's main strength is that she has so many of the positive qualities of both literary and commercial fiction. Her writing is atmospheric, it's pacey, she's great at naturally incorporating the historical material into the narrative, which is not easy when you've done this much research. She makes the archives feel alive for the reader and for the characters. This is one of those books where I stayed up late one night because I had to finish the last 80 pages, and there's something that's so satisfying about a chunky book that you can fly through. I'm not leaving my fellow nonfiction readers out in the cold. I want to end with a nonfiction option called Prague, Belonging in the Modern City by Chad Bryant. It is so funny to me that I have a man named Chad on my Czech Literature starter kit, but here we are. Each of these 5 chapters tells the story of somebody who felt like an outsider in Prague from the 1840s to today. And what's so impactful about the structure is that the marginalized identities end up flipping. So in the mid-19th century, we have a man who was a Czech-speaking guidebook writer at a time when German was dominant in the city. In the next chapter, we jump to the 1910s and we meet a German-speaking journalist at a time when Czech nationalism was becoming dominant. In the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, we spend time with a communist in a Prague that's non-communist. And then the 4th chapter offers us the story of someone who was an outsider in the later communist era. We end with a perspective that you don't hear about much in nonfiction about the Czech Republic. It's the perspective of a Czech Vietnamese woman in the present day, and about these Vietnamese immigrant communities whose children feel like they're straddling 2 worlds. It's so clever to juxtapose the voices of these people from different eras who are building their own communities in a city that's unfavorable to people like them, but the unfavorable people like them keeps changing. There are also all these details about the evolving ways that people interacted with the cityscape, about how in the 19th century, strolling through a city became much more of a social pastime. We see in the 20th century that there's this surge in cafe culture. I mean, I love that kind of thing. And I like that each chapter is a clean 50 pages. It makes the reading process very manageable. I would say that Brian's academic background comes through in ways both negative and positive. One of the negatives is that he has that academic's instinct to give many examples to all prove the same point. And in the first 2 chapters, I noticed there were some repetitive paragraphs, and I think part of that is that academics are trained to have sort of a linear progression of providing information. You go from point A to point B to point C. But a trade nonfiction reader is happy to jump with you from point A to C. Like, we don't need to re-establish B to get to the new information. But where his training shines through is in the way I would often finish a page or 2 and think, I cannot believe how much information he just gracefully compressed into 2 or 3 paragraphs. Like, how many pitch-perfect quotes and fascinating sources I was just exposed to with very little effort on my part. Overall, you get the rigor of a historian packaged in a general reader-friendly way. I think that Brian has done something really interesting with this project. 21st century, yay! Contemporary authors, yay! It's been my absolute pleasure to guide you through these books, and if you're up for it, there's nothing I would love more than hearing which of the 15 stood out to you as something you might read. And I don't usually say this, but if there's someone in your life who you think might appreciate this video, and if you sent them the link, that would be so lovely. I'm a small channel over here, I don't have a big reach, and it would mean a lot to me for this video in particular to really find its people. I'm taking off next week for the holidays, and I'll be back the first week of January with another video. Happy holidays to all of you. A mějte se hezky.